We begin the current Daf Mesechtes Nazir Daf Samach Dalad. Begin on the bottom of Samach Gimel Mabeis, 4 lines up at the bottom of the Yamid, where the Gemara continues in a somewhat parenthetical conversation from the halacha of our Mishnah. We had mentioned this unique halacha of Tumas HaTohaim. Now, in describing that example, we gave a case of a guy's going to the mikveh in the ma'ara, in a cave, and they find a dead person floating on the opening of the cave. So we describe regarding when it was, what was the circumstances. Now, in that conversation, it was talking about that it was floating. So on that, the Gemara is going to describe that this halacha of floating being a problem of Tumah, if you're going to describe it not as, let's say, Tumas HaTohaim, and it's going to have the halacha Sabik Tumah B'Shus HaYachid. However, regarding when it's regarding a sheretz, regarding Tumas Maga, actually it's going to have a different halacha. Hashem corresponds to Bakazich and Cheskel, turn to Daf Yomi. Appreciate you joining for today's daf. Some discussing today's daf are, like we were saying, tzafa, halacha of floating, ein metamal in sheretz. We'll actually not have the halacha of tumah regarding the tumah of a sheretz, a dead insect that's metame. Tzafa b'kli, the halacha of the machlekes in the Gemara regarding, do we differentiate regarding if it's floating in the vessel versus if it's floating on the ground? Also, an interesting question that the Gemara has regarding, so there's unique halacha, as we're going to describe, regarding floating versus if it's stationary. Now, what happens if a sheretz that is noch, it is not floating, but it's on another item that is safa b'mayim? So the Gemara is going to have many different variations of that halacha. Well, are we considering that as floating because what it's on is floating, but when you're on the boat, are you floating or are you stationary? That's essentially the question that the Gemara is going to have regarding the halacha of tumah sheretz. And then Rav Amnuna on Amud Beis says Nazav Oisa Pesach Shahocha B'Kever HaTohaim B'Shvi Shalending Bitar. And the Gemara is going to ask, that seems to be contradicted from the halacha of our Mishnah that describes that if you're on your purification process, then we will actually consider you as a Cheskes Tumah even when it relates to Kever HaTohaim. And the Gemara is going to explain what is the exact case of Rav Amnuna. So begin the current Daf Samach Gimel Mabeis, 4 lines up at the bottom of the Yamid. We had mentioned in the Mishnah, as we described, a case of the Yared Litful B'Ma'ara. If you're going to a table in the cave, and it's a Meitzav Al Ma'ara, you say we're Tummy because it's considered Tummy Yadua, since the Tummy was obviously not covered, it was floating over there, and we said Sabik Tummy Shuz Yachid, Svekei Tummy. So that's where the Gemara now starts and makes a distinction. The Gemara quotes the words in the Mishnah, Kate said, oh, what's the case of Tumah that you're going to be Tummy? Is Yarat, a guy goes down to a table in the mikveh, like we said, and so we said that since it's floating, is obviously not Tumas HaTohaim, you're going to be Tameh. But, says the Gemara, Tzafa, floating, ain't a metamal in sheretz. Although we said in the Mishnah, when there's Tumas Mes, it is going to be Tameh, it's not going to contaminate regarding Tumah B'Sheretz. The Tanya, like we learned in the Bryce, which actually the Rosh has a Mishnah in the 4th paragraph of Mesechtes Taharos, which the Mishnah there says, Safek Tumah Tzafa. You have a Safek of Tumah that's floating. Bein bekalim, whether in vessels, meaning if there's water in a bowl and there's a sheretz that's floating on the surface of the water, you're not sure, did you touch the sheretz, did you not touch it? Or bein bekarka, whether it's water on the ground. Either way, tahayra, you're going to be tah. So you see this halacha that there's no problem about floating tumah when it comes to the tumah of sheretz. Now, that's the Tanna Kama. Shimon, however, he does differentiate. He says, became Tameim. However, he holds in the vessel, it will be Tamei, Bekarka Taira. But in the ground, okay, that will be Tar. That's the Machlekes. But again, we see that there is an element of Safik, of the Tumah, of Saf, of floating, by Sheretz, is going to be Tar. So as you continue to have Samach Dal and Av, once we brought in this Machlekes, so the Gemara says, what's the understanding of these two different opinions? My Tanna Kama, what's the reason of the Tanna Kama? So I'm going to Yitzchak Bar Abedimi. Because it says Ksiv and Pasuk in Yikra. It says B'chala sheretz hasheretz, in anything that the creature is going to crawl. Now it sounds like Kol Makom Shu Sheretz. Wherever it crawls, the halach is going to be that it's going to be mitame, even on the water. That's what it would sound like. Now Ksiv, however, it says previously ala aretz, if it crawls on the ground, which sounds like that it's specifically dafka on the aretz, it's going to be mitame. So haketzad. So how do we resolve this? Is it metame on water, or is it not metame? Says the Gemara. This is the understanding of the Tanna Kama. Vadei magoi, a definite touching of the sheretz. Yeah, tame, that's going to be tame wherever it's sheretz, wherever it's crawling. Yeah, even on water. But safek magoi, if you're not sure if you touched it, then tahar. Then you're going to be tahar on the water. That's why the pasuk picked specifically ala aretz tameh. On the ground it's going to be tameh. If it's a tameh b'shur sayachid and you're not sure, then we're going to say the suffix is going to be tameh. But when it's floating, which is not stationary, then we didn't say it. Which says that we're not sure, however, in this that we're saying that when it's floating, it's going to be tahar, because it's not stationary. Is that specifically on the surface of water? Or would the same thing be floating in the air? If someone throws it in the air, would you say that it's going to be tar also from this meat of ala aretz? Says Taisus, that would be a suffix. Is that included in the exclusion of suffix magoi is going to be tar? But Akapan, that's the source of the Tanakama, that it's only vada magoi that is the pasuk b'chol hasheretz hasheretz, wherever it's going to crawl. But the other miyut of ala aretz, that excluding if it's floating on the water, that is telling you when you're not sure suffix magoi is going to be tar. That we learn that from ala aretz. Now, what's Rabbi Shimon Aitam? What's the reason Rabbi Shimon that he differentiates between a kli and if it's floating in a vessel or floating on water on the ground? Because Ama'uli Siksiv, the pasuk says later on, it says ach mayin. However, a spring, and the pasuk there says ubayr, and the pit mikvei mayim, that is a gathering of water, yeh tahar. It's going to be tahar. Now, at the same time, the end of that pasuk says yitma, it will be tameh. So it sounds like, on the one hand, that it's telling me that if it's in water, it's going to be tar. The end of the pasuk says, "When they gave him the v'lasam yitma," sounds like it's going to be tameh. So how to resolve this? Oh, so we differentiate. Tzafa bekalim, if it's floating in vessels, tameh, it's going to be tameh. Bekarka, if it's floating on water on the ground, tar, it's going to be tar. Because as Taisa explains, that specifically what's similar to what the pasuk says is going to be yi a tar, what does it say? It says, a mayin, a bur, mikveh mayim, those are waters that are on the ground. That's going to be tar. But if it's water in the bowl, in the cup, in the vessel, then that is going to be tameh. Therefore, that's the machlekes between Tanakam and the Reb Shimon regarding this halacha of tzafa, of the tumah, of sheretz, if it's going to be tameh or not, that we say it's going to be tahar. Is it totally, or like Reb Shimon, it's only ala karka, but not in the kli? Okay, continue on this theme of this tumah of tzaf. So tumah in the braysa. Kol hanitalan. Whatever is taken, meaning you have a person standing in water, his friend was lowering down or moving around the sheretz. Now, the guy who's in the water is swimming around, is not sure that he touched the guy's sheretz or not. Or let's say v'hanigrorin. Or his friend, let's say, is dragging a sheretz on the water. He's not sure that he touched it or not. But the main thing is that in these two cases, his friend is holding it, pulling it, shaking it, moving it, whatever. So in this case, sveikon tameh. So the doubt, if you touch the sheretz, you're going to be tameh. Why? Because it's not considered the halach of tzafa. As Mneshe Kumunachin, they're placed. What does that mean, placed? I thought the guy's moving it around. No, since the hand of his friend is holding it, that does not give it the quality of the halach of tumah tzafa, of the tumah floating. It's considered like stationary, and therefore the suffix is going to be a regular suffix tumah shusayachid, and you're going to be tameh. Now, vanizrakin. However, if it was thrown, then sveikon. Then if you have a suffix, you touched it or not, tar, you're going to be tar. Again, that will qualify for halacha of if it's thrown, let's say, on the water, that suffix you're going to be tar. Chutz, except min kezayis hames. What does that mean? Except for the case of an olive size of a dead person. So, like the Rush explains, where if, let's say, someone threw an olive-sized piece of a mess, now you're not sure, was it mahel al taharis? Did it hover over taharis, the halach of oil? Then that taharis will be considered as tameh, because the halacha of that taharis of tumah, of floating, is learned out from the psukim, that we learn that from the halacha of sheretz, like we just brought before, b'chol ha-sheretz ha-sheretz. Now, the halacha of sheretz is halacha of tumas maga. There's no tumas oil. So therefore, that heter was said regarding maga. It wasn't said regarding oil. So if you have this suffix of tzafa regarding oil, like Gezayis Menames, when you threw it, is it over taharis? That would not be included in that heter. So too, v'amal al panei tumah. That if someone is leaning over a tumah, for example, let's say you have a person that's going in the water, and you find a kezayis from a mace that's stationary there in the water. Now, we're not sure did the tar person pass over it, and therefore he's ma'al on the mess. Now, in such a case, by sheretz, we would say you're tar. Or even by mess. If we're not sure if you touched it, we would say you'd be tar. Because, as Tais explains, there's no difference between if the tara is floating and the tumah is stationary. It's the same thing like the tumah floating and the tar person stationary. But that would only be regarding maga. But by oihel, that we wouldn't say. Because again, where did we learn this halacha of tumat safa of a heter? It was learned specifically by sheretz, as we just brought. And that's halacha of tumas maga. So it's not going to apply to other tumas like oihel or v'chol davar or anything shemetama milmala kelmata that contaminates on the top of you like beneath you. What does that mean? Lasuya zav zava. That comes to include a zav or a zava where they contaminate with a different tuma, not of maga, but rather of hesed, of causing something to move. And that's the idea because what's called el yoynei shel zav v'zava, what's above the zav v'zava, is kilamata, is like, we know there's a halach of tumas mishkav, that what you lay on, the bedding gets the tumah as the person itself. Now, what's above them has the same halacha like what's beneath them. When we do make a difference is someone that's boil nida, then we differentiate, but that what we mean to say is if a zava passing by in the water and there's a vessel next to them, not sure did he cause it to move, we're not going to purify it because of, oh, this is a tumah of floating, where the tumah was floating, we're not sure. No, that's only by tumas maga that we're going to say it's going to be tahar, which is similar to the case of sheretz. So if, let's say there's what's called midrasis. Tumas medras is a tumah when you step on something, where a zav is passing, we're not sure did he step on it, you're not going to purify it because of a tumah of floating. With that zav was swimming in the pool, you're not going to say, oh, he was floating, which again we said in Taisus is the same thing. If the tumah is floating, the Torah is floating. We're not going to say that because it's only said by the tumah of maga, like we learned by sheretz, and therefore that's why the Gemara says that these are going to be exceptions to the rule. Even though there's floating over here, it's going to be tummy. Now this is where it gets interesting. So we're saying, okay, there's this unique halach of tumas maga that when it's floating, the suffix we're going to say is going to be tahar. So Bayram Bachama says, what happens if meis bekli? What happens if you have a dead part of a person's body or a dead body, whatever it is in the vessel? V'kli tzaf apanei hamayim, and you have the vessel that's floating on the surface of the water. Now, as the Rosh explains, you know that it, let's say, wasn't mahil on the person. It didn't hover over him. The whole suffix is, did it touch him or did it not touch him? Which therefore says the Rosh, the same thing you could have asked by a sheretz in the kli. It doesn't have to be dafka meis, but the question is mahu. What's the halacha? What's the question? So the Gemara explains. I'll tell you what the question is. Do we say that Boster Kliyaz Linan, and the girsa we're going to go is with Taisis. The Rosh translates this very differently. Do we go based on the vessel, and meaning klapi the vessel, the dead person or the sheretz is noch, is stationary? Oy Boster, and the girsa wouldn't be Misa. According to the Rosh, the girsa would be, but like the Vilna Gaon says, obviously Taisis girsa was not Misa, take out the Saf, it was Maya. Oy Boster Maya is Linan. Or do we go in regards to the water? Regards to the water, you see this as not stationary, it's floating along the water. So how do you qualify this? Do you qualify it based on its relationship to the vessel that it's in, and that it's stationary in regards to the vessel? Or do we view it in relation to the water? In relation to the water, it's floating on the water. So is this a floating tumah or not? Moreover, says the Gemara, imtim, so let me begin to say, according to the Rosh, you have to add on the word lav over here, but according to Taisus, no. If you say basa kliyazlin, then we go based on the vessel, meaning we view it as stationary in regards to the vessel. It's not moving on the vessel itself. So now my question is, okay, so obviously you consider it as stationary even though it's floating on the water, but that's regarding in a vessel. What happens if it's not in a vessel? It's meisal gabe sheretz mahu. You have a dead person on top of a sheretz. Now, what's the halacha? What's the question over here? So it says the Gemara, Kibin dahay tumas erev, since this is tamei only until the evening. Meaning regarding a tumas sheretz only in the evening. Vahay tumas sheba, and the tumah of a dead person, a tumah of 7 days. Oh, so kamanda mach the tumah b'kli damya. It's like as if the tumah body is in a vessel because it's considered as something distinct, something different. Obviously, every molecule is considered resting on the molecule beneath it, and we still view it as floating in the water.
And you only touch the shirts, you didn't touch the mace, meaning?
it doesn't make a difference because.
Why aren't they talking about tumas meis?
Oh yeah, no, no. In the Chanami, we're talking about tumas maga, like the Rosh explained. The Rosh said that mace and sheretz are the same regarding maga. The only difference would be regarding the tumah of that of oihel. So the question is, would we say tumah saf over here, or not? So the question is, when it's in a bowl, so you could say it's resting because on the bowl it's resting. I don't care that the bowl is floating. But the question is, when it's on another source of tumah, do you say, okay, that the sheretz on the bottom is like a bowl because it's something distinct? And the reason why it's distinct is because they're very different tumas. Tumas sheretz is only till the evening, and tumas meis is for 7 days. Or maybe no, since they're both sources of tumah, so tumas mechti is like one big thick element of tumah, which that's floating on the water. Can't view that as stationary on the thing beneath it, because it's all one thing. Maybe you're going to say, come on, that no, their tumah is different, and therefore you're going to view the mess as if it's floating on the sheretz, meaning as if it's stationary on the sheretz, and I don't care that the sheretz is floating in the water, we're going to consider it as not tumas safa, meaning it's going to be considered as, and actually the gears of the Vilna Gaon actually is to switch it from the Rambam, it's sheretz on the mess, and that would be relevant to the question of, would you say that, what are we talking about, the tumas safa of the sheretz versus that of the mess? Because Yitaka didn't, if you wouldn't say the tumas safa on the mess. But be that as it may, so would you say kamad demach the tumah b'kli damya, that it's in the, like as if it's floating in the vessel because the tumah is different? So if you say that, now I have the following question. So okay, b'tumah vadi, that case you're going to say you're defending b'tameh because it's not a tumah saf, it's a tumah that's stationary because it's on what it's stationary in regards to the vessel. But sheretz agabi nevela, what do you say regarding if you have a dead bug on a dead animal? The nevela tzafa mahu, and the nevela is floating. Why is this different than what we just said before? Oh, because given that tzvai tumas ervinin. So even if you can say the previous case that you'll view them as distinct and therefore it's going to be considered as stationary, not floating, because it's like stationary on the bowl, and we consider the sheretz on the bottom as a bowl because they're considered different types of tumas. But what happens if they're both tumas erev? So maybe you'd say tumas michti. Maybe that is considered one thing tumah, and it's like one thing tumah, and therefore it's not like it's stationary because it's one item. So it's floating on the water, and therefore you'll say the kula of tumas safa. Maybe no, they're still different. Why are they different? Because high kazayis in the vela, its shear, its measurement to be mitame is the shear of a kazayis, the size of an olive. The high kadasha, but by a sheretz, is the measurement of a lentil, and therefore it would be like it's munach bekli, and therefore maybe you would say that you're not going to have the kulois, and you would say that the suffix is going to be tame. Another question says the Gemara, sheretz al gebi sheretz ma'u. What's halacha if you have one dead bug on top of another dead bug? What's the question? So the Gemara explains, Mahu, what's the halacha? Hani vadi chad shiur, and then would you say, okay, this is most definitely one shear, and therefore it would be tumas safa because it's one item, and therefore you would say the kula? Maybe no. Given the mifsek ma'adadi loy, since the they're separate, they're two different bugs, you would say the top one is resting on the bottom one, and the bottom one is floating, but the top one would be a safek tumah that you'd have to be machmer. Maybe you're going to say sheretz agabe sheretz. Keeping the mifsek ma'adadi, since they're separate from each other, it's like it's resting in the vessel, and therefore you would not have the kulais, you'd be stringent. What's in the following case? Sheretz agabe nevelo sheni moichumau. If you have a dead bug that's on top of a dead animal that has dissolved, what's halacha? So what's the question? So the Gemara explains. Given the nemoicha, since it dissolved, it liquefied, so avali mashka. So would you say that this nevela is like a liquid, and therefore the sheretz that's on top is like tumah that's floating on the water because it's floating on the liquefied part of this nevela? I didn't know. This is a food item because that's where it originated from. You can't call it as a halach of tzafa when it's on something that's a food item. And if you're going to say that yes, it is a food item, you don't consider it as a mashka. So therefore, the sheretz that's on top of it is like it's not floating on the water because the nevela that's been liquefied, that's floating on the water, its shear is the shear of a kazayis. Whereas the shear of the bug is the shear of a kadash, of a lentil. So it's like it's stationary. But my question is, Sheretz al gabe shichva zera mahu. What's halacha if you have a dead bug on semen? Would we consider the semen as mashka to be considered as the halacha of tumas tzafa of floating? And says the Gemara, if you're going to say kivin the misakra, since it was uprooted from a person's body, so it's not considered as a mashka, rather it's considered as a food item, meaning as a salad. So the question is, sheretz agabe mechatas, which the mechatas are the purifying ash waters of the paraduma, which you have ashes and you have water. Through the ashes, it becomes thick, which the Re says, just to pick specifically mechatas, the truth is, you could have picked any ash water, if it's considered a mashka or not. It's just actually adding on another chiddush. That even though you could say that since lamaisa they're both tumah, because actually the ash waters are matame, the tahirim, so therefore maybe you say it's like a one big thick tumah that's floating on the water. Even so, the Gemara is saying you could ask the question: do we say that since the mechatos is a bona fide mashka, so it still has a halacha of mashka in it, and therefore it's going to be like tumah floating on the water because it's considered the mechatos are like liquid? Or do you say that no, right now lamaisa it's earth, and therefore it would be considered as stationary, and the Vilna Gaon says to take out the next words umechatas stuff and and it's only the mechatas that floating on the water, because all the questions didn't mention this element. But now, what's the halacha? Would we say that it's considered floating, or because it's considered as one item, or would you say that it's stationary because the mice it's thick, and it's like a uchla, and therefore the sheretz is stationary on the mechatas? Says the Gemara, lo yadina, we don't know. Take that it's then all these cases is not clear regarding how do you qualify the object as stationary or floating. Do you view it in regards to what's beneath it, and how do we qualify the thing that's beneath it regarding to say, is this floating in regards to the water or not? Tintamid Beis, where the Gemara continues regarding the previous Mishnah, we had discussed the case of Tumas Adayim. We said, Yared Litful b'ma'arav. If someone goes to table in the cave, we said, Nimtza b'shuka b'karka ma'ara. If you find the source of the tumah, the dead person that's buried in the ground of the cave, so he said it depends. If a yard lahakar, if he went to cool off tar, because dam machus of halachas gemir, let's halacha mesh b'sin that at tumas time you're going to be tar. But we said if let's say you're going to be tar with tumas meis, then you're going to be tamei because although that's tumas time, but shecheskes tamei b'cheskes tar. These reglaim ladav l'maisa you were tamei, and you were trying to purify yourself, and as you went, you subsequently found out that there was a tumas time over there. Then the Mishnah said we're not going to say the heter of tumas time. Now, related to this halacha that the Gemara is going to actually ask on, Amar Rav Nuna. Rav Nuna says, Nazir v'Isa Pesach. These two cases that we apply the halachas of Tumas Atayim, says if you have a Nazir or someone that's coming to bring his Karban Pesach, Shahochu b'keverat Tahayim, they went through a Kabatim B'Shvi Shalen on their day 7, meaning you have a Nazir that was Tameh. He sprayed himself day 3, day 7, he tabled. On that day, he went by an area where he finds out later it was a Keverat Tahayim. But he didn't know until he finished his Naziris, and he already brought his Karbanas. Says Rav Nuna, Tahayrim, they're going to be Tahar, and it's not going to be Saisir, their Karban Pesach, or his Naziris. My time, what's the reason? Rav Nuna explains, the Tumah of time of the depth, and no one ever knew about it. No one in the world is not enough to be Saisir these two halachas. And that must be Rabbi asked him the halacha of Mishnah. What are you talking about? We know Tumas Atayim, but it's not exactly like you're saying. The Mishnah told us Yardli Tahar Mitumas Ames. If let's say even Nazir Oisa Pesach, but he was Tameh and he was going to purify himself in Tumas Hames, and then we find out later that where he went to table actually had a Tumas Atayim. Oh, Tameh is going to be Tameh. Why? Because Shecheskes Tameh. The presumed state of the prior status of a Tameh remains Tameh. And Shecheskes Tar. Someone who has had the Chazak Tar here remains Tar. So obviously you see that where you are mischazik b'tumasai, we're not going to purify you even with tumasatayim. So how could Rav Nuna say b'shvisha when they're trying to purify themselves, they're going to be tar? So that Amalei, and there's different girsayis here, and according to the Rush, he says Abai, and therefore he has to try to resolve how to read the rest of the Gemara. We just have Amalei, doesn't say who it is. Medinalach ben Nazir shemachusat haglachas. So Rav had asked the question, and that Abai or whoever was answered. He says, no, our mission is not difficult. I agree to you in the case of a Nazir that still didn't do his hair cutting ceremony. In other words, the teglachas of Tumah. The Mishnah is talking about where he didn't do his hair cutting ceremony yet. So he's even missing the tefillah because we said the case was where he's going down to Tevel. And for sure he didn't do the haircut after that. So he's mamish like in the middle of his naziris. That's what we're going to say, your Rabbi Cheska's tamei, you're going to remain tamei. Rav Nun is talking about, it was day 7, but he already cut his hair. So although he didn't yet have Harav Shemesh sundown for his tefillah on day 7, that's not considered a Cheska's tamei, as the Gemara is going to shortly explain. So therefore, they're fundamentally different, although it's also on day 7, but it's achar the taglachas, it's after he went to the mikveh. So that's where Rav Nun is going to say, it's not going to be seiser. Our Mishnah says that it is going to be seiser is because he didn't yet do his taglachas, he didn't do yet his tefillah. Therefore, that the taglachas is a maisa that you didn't do yet. That's considered mechusa maisa. Therefore, that's going to be considered cheskes tamei. On that, I'm like Rava is the one who asked the question, and that's why the Rosh is busy trying to explain what's Rava really answering here. He says, I also agree to you in the case. Bois the Pesach, if a guy's going to do his Korban Pesach, I agree to you that he's not missing anything. In other words, that after he tevel, after he cut his hair, you're right. So he's not missing anything. So the Rosh says it's like a question, like he asks, what's the chiddush of Amnuna? If that's the case that he's talking about, what's the chiddush? So of course you'll be tahar because you're not missing anything. Abai says, what do you mean? There is a chiddush over here. What do you mean missing sundown? Rav Nun is saying a big chiddush that even though it's on day 7, he did his haircut already, but he's not tahar. Why didn't you say cheskes tamei? Why didn't you say lochav Mishnah that you're not tamei, you're not tahar yet, so you shouldn't say tumas time to be pure? Amalei, so on that Rabbi said, no, shimsha memela arva. The sun by itself sets. You're not missing anything major over here to tell me any chidushim over here. The sun sets every day by itself. There's not missing anything. And the Gemara says, Abai also ultimately retracted and agreed that the sun sets by itself. That's not considered as any chisarin in tahara to say that cheskes tamei. You're tahar already. Are you not? Okay, it's just technicality. You have to wait for Harav Shemesh. You have to wait for the sun to set. The Tanya, like we learned in the Brisa, that tells us regarding a woman, they gave birth to a girl, which we know the halacha is that she has to wait 80 days of Yomei Tumah with Yomei Tara, and then she brings a carbon as Yeledis. Now, what happens if she has a miscarriage on Yom Melois, day that she finishes her counting of the 80 days? So then she brings a carbon. So, as Tais explains, this that we're saying that if she miscarries on Yom Melois, it's not really precise, because for sure, la'achar Melois, that she would bring another carbon besides the first carbon for her first baby, because you have to bring a carbon for a miscarriage also, it's considered as giving birth to a baby. What we mean to say rather is if she gave birth even on day 81, which is after the 80 days, she's going to have to bring 2 carbonas for 2 babies. One was let's say the healthy baby, and then the other one, which obviously after 80 days, you're not really having a full-term baby, but she'll have to bring a carbon at that point, because it's after the time of the Melois. Now, Toich Melois, but let's say she gave birth a second time, within the days of Leda, which is up to 80 days we count as considered post-birth, postnatal, for giving birth to a girl, so then Leitavi, she's not going to bring another carbon, she'll only bring 1 carbon, because you never had a time that you were yet obligated for your first carbon. Says the Brisa, so you would think, okay, fine. She's not going to bring another carbon for a birth that she had before the 80 days were up. But you would think she brings a carbon for a birth that's after the 80 days. Meaning, what does this mean? Like Taisa explains. Let's say she gave birth a second time on day 64 from the first Leda. Obviously, that birth was not a full-term baby. It's after 40 days. But it's, and the reason why it's 64 is because after you have tummy for 14 days, the only possibility of getting pregnant, and then it would be another 40 days to have this 64 days. But Akaponim, then she miscarried again 64 days from the second birth, which is within the Melois, which is the 80-day period of the second birth, but it's after the Melois of the first birth. And the Girsa of Taisa obviously takes the words Batifta Mishtayan. So you would think that, Okay, but in such a case where you're post 80 days of the first birth, but you're within 80 days of the second quote-unquote birth, you think then you would have to bring another carbon. No, Tamalema, it's the pasuk teacher by Yikra. That when you complete the days of your purification, meaning whatever is toich the malais, whether it's from the first birth or whether it's from the second birth, you're going to be exempt through the carbon that you bring for the first one, and therefore you're only going to bring one carbon, because b'yoy malais tavi, only when you finished your 80 days you're going to bring another carbon. Toich malais loy tavi. When you're within the 80 days, you're not going to bring it. So since you're still within 80 days of the second carbon, meaning not really bringing a second carbon from the second birth, which is exempt from the first one because within 80 days of the first one, so therefore you're not going to bring a carbon for the third one. Now, this is what we're bringing. We're bringing this in because we wanted to show where Abaya ultimately retracted and held that Herav Shemesh is something that's automatic, it's just a technicality. The question of the Gemara at this point is, wait a second, why are you not bringing a second carbon on the third birth? Because that's Achar Malais of the first one. It's after 80 days, you're only bringing one carbon so far. You gave birth, 80 days after the first birth, you're going to bring a carbon of a Yoledis. That's the days of Tahara and Tumah Tahara for 14 days and 66. It's 80 days of giving birth after a girl. Now, within those 80 days, the woman had a miscarriage. So since it was after 40 days, okay, you would have to bring a carbon, but you're still within the 80 days. But then let's say within the 80 days of that second birth, you have a third birth, quote unquote, second miscarriage. You're not going to bring a third carbon. The question is, why not? It's Acham Alois to the first one. So on that, Rav Kahani says, no, Shani Hachi, here it's different. The mixture of carbon, because you're lacking a carbon. In other words, the reason why you're going to be exempt with just one carbon is because you're missing the carbon of the Leda. Meaning, you never had a moment that you were appropriate to bring a carbon of the first birth, because it says in the Torah, now, since she gave birth a second time, which is really like a miscarriage, but she couldn't bring a carbon for the first birth until she finishes the malais of the second Leda. Now, since she never got a chance to finish the second one until the third one was born, meaning the miscarriage, so therefore it's all going to be exempt with the first carbon. That's what Rav Kahana explains. The question, however, is, wait a second. Hasam nami there also mechaser herav shemesh. You're missing herav shemesh. What does this mean? So like Taisa explains, it's like v'havinam, but it's like we're asking a question. We're saying, wait a second. There, by that birth, achar malais, why do you bring a carbon for the second birth? Meaning, we had said in the Brisa that if, let's say, yoy malais, the first case, we said if a woman has a baby and then she miscarries on day 81 by the yoy malais, we say that, then she'll bring a second carbon. The question is, why is she bringing a carbon for the second birth? But she's still missing herav shemesh. What does that mean? So Taisa explains. Aren't we also talking about a case where a woman did not toivel, although the halacha allows a woman to toivel 14 days after giving birth to a girl, and then for the next 60 days, actually any blood that actually comes out actually ultimately considered as tar. But it could be a woman didn't toivel at the end of the 2 weeks, and even after the 80 days, she's not fit then to bring a carbon later for the first one, even though it's after 80 days, because she didn't toivel yet. And even so, we see in the Bryce that she's bringing another carbon for the second birth, that's achar malais. Why? You're missing, for sure, herav shemesh. You might even be missing even your tevilah. So why don't we say that you're not fit yet to bring your carbon? Because you're still tamei. And you told me whenever you're not fit yet to bring a carbon, we consider that as like toich malais. So why you bring another carbon in that case? Abaya says, Shim Shem Meila Arve says, no, the sun sets by itself. In other words, I don't have to tell you regarding the fact that, let's say, this woman has not yet teveled. That's not considered as a chesaron to say that cheska is tomei. No, because the mikveh is in front. You could just, what's called biyadei litva, you have the ability to tevel. But even herav shemesh, which you don't have the ability to turn the clock and make it already sundown, that's not considered as a chesaron. Because the sun, memela, sets by itself. So you see Abai himself retracting and saying this same idea of Shim Shemei La'arv agreeing to Rava that, that wouldn't be any chedushin, there wouldn't be any problem about cheskes tamei, like we had explained for Rav Nuna, that, b'shvishla, and they're going to be tahar with kever ta'im, even though you were going to be toiveling because you already had done your taglachas, and all you needed was sundown. That's not considered as like in the state of Tumah. So Tais says, someone explained this, that you're missing Herb Shemesh is actually from the rabbinic tefillah at the end of 81 days, as the Gemara says in Chagid Daf Chaf Aleph, which that would be like every woman. And it says, no, it doesn't seem appropriate because, first of all, we're talking about biblical halacha over here, and that's rabbinic. Moreover, that tefillah doesn't require Herb Shemesh. As the Gemara says over there, Mechusik Kippurim requires tefillah kodesh, tefillah yes, Herb Shemesh no, and therefore that would not be applicable. Thank you to any time for hosting us.